Do you remember much about the missile crisis and the tension between of like the nuclear possibility of Armageddon at the time, around 1962 and three?
Yeah, yeah. The the Soviet Union moved nuclear-tipped missiles into Cuba. They installed them, and I believe they were probably operationally ready. They were detected by U.S. intelligence. We had photos of their installation. We knew exactly what was going on. And it was a time of enormous tension over nuclear issues. The Iron Curtain had been erected, and so you had the Soviet Union developing nuclear missiles. The United States had a considerable number of them. And so we were at swords' points at different places. Now, we didn't know it at the time, but the United States had installed nuclear missiles in Turkey. That was done before the Soviet Union put them into Cuba. So it seemed very one-dimensional to people back at that time. It seemed like here the Soviet Union was just bringing these missiles 90 miles from the shores of the United States. And during that era of nuclear tensions, school children all across America would go through nuclear drills, and they were taken very seriously. And the teacher would say, okay, we're going to simulate a nuclear drill. You know what to do. And every child would jump under their desks, and you would hold one hand over the back of your neck to protect it somewhat from things falling from the roof. And then you would take your other arm and you would shield your eyes, because when the blast goes off, there's a tremendous blinding flash that is so bright that it actually can permanently blind. And you might say, well, how's that going to save you from a nuclear blast? But the fact is that that was the best protection that you had. And it made very good sense to train people because we were very seriously worried about a nuclear incident. And people, nations went to extraordinary levels to avoid the risk of nuclear war. So yes, we were going through that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we were going through it afterwards, after the whole thing had been settled. But that was a time when there was genuine concern in the United States that a nuclear confrontation might break out. We didn't know, of course, at the time how dominant the United States had become in nuclear weapons. All we knew was they had them and we had them, and we didn't know the proportions. But there's no doubt that, had they used them, had something happened back then, they would have been able to fire them at the nation's capital, perhaps New York City, that kind of thing. Later on, it's interesting. I was stationed in Germany. Now, I was lieutenant colonel in the Army JAG Corps at that point, and there was a tremendous level of nuclear tension. By then, the Soviet Union was much more heavily armed with nuclear weapons. We were much more heavily armed. And I remember going to East Berlin there was a special corridor that Americans were allowed to travel. And after the end of the Second World War, Berlin had been chopped up into districts that came under the British, the French, the Americans, and the Soviets. And each nation's troops were allowed to enter Berlin and to travel through the sectors. We couldn't go into the Soviet sector, but the others we could. And so I had a very interesting visit with my family. We went there, and you could cut the tension with a knife. It was incredible. But a week or two after we had made our trip, there was a carload of three young JAG families, the Judge Advocate General, the attorneys. There were several captains and their wives, and they went there. And the protocol was extremely strict. You would pull your car into a checkpoint. There would be a Russian officer or Russian soldier who would walk around your car. He would come up and he would salute you. You were required to salute. You had to be in uniform. And then you would go out. You'd take your documents. You go to a little wooden building. There was no furniture inside, just a slot in the wall. And you would take your documents, put them in the slot. You actually heard them fall and hit the floor on the other side. And they would take them and they would do time and distance calculations to make sure that you hadn't diverted on your trip. And then when they were finished, they would take your documents, push them through the slot, and they would fall on the floor, and you would get them together and then go back out to the car, and then you drive on to the next checkpoint. Well, this group of young JAG captains, one of the wives decided it'd just be great to have a photo to recall this really bizarre time. And she snapped a picture of the Soviet Guard. Because of the worry about something blowing up and escalating to a nuclear confrontation, the Soviets called the NATO side and reported this incident. All it was just snapping one little photograph of an ordinary soldier, a guard. Within 24 hours, every one of those JAG officers was relieved of duties. Their families were put on a plane. Their children were pulled out of schools. All of their furniture, all of their if they had cars, the cars were put aboard ship. Everything within 24 hours was all on its way back to the United States. Now, the reason for this draconian action for such a trivial thing was the fear of some escalation where someone might snap a picture, perhaps a Soviet guard would make some remark, somebody yells out the window. The next thing, you have pushing and shoving. Soon you have troops coming to respond. Next thing, somebody shoots, and before long, some shooting breaks out on both sides, and it just goes up the chain until a nuclear weapon is fired. That's what they were trying to prevent. There was a keen comprehension of the danger of nuclear war at that time. It's gone. We've lost our historical recollection of the severity of nuclear weapons. Nuclear explosions seem to be almost theoretical. Back in those days, older people remembered the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed so many Japanese civilians. and nobody wanted it to happen again, not on either side of the Cold War. So today it's very worrisome because there seems to be just this air of this consensus of recklessness and this mad insanity, this willingness to do things that are just obscenely provocative. The U.S. involvement, for example, in the sinking of the Russian flagship, the Moskva, which was a cruiser and a big ship, and it was our missile, and probably people who were U.S. contractors who fired the missile and sank this flagship and sent 300 young Russian sailors to the bottom. It is only because of the great self-discipline of President Putin that we haven't done something that has blown up and triggered the commencement of a world war.